Alrighty, I'm going to talk a little bit about lesson 5.09 and 5.010. And so the opening slide is who is Nathaniel Hawthorne. And so a little bit about him. We have a little bio down here. He was born in Salem, July 4th, 1804. He was his ancestors, so his like great grandparents and whatnot, were some of the first one of the first Puritan families to come from England in 1630. During his life, he was friends with some of the most famous authors and intellectuals that we know of today. Louisa May Alcott, Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he had a very strong friendship with Herman Melville, who wrote the book Moby Dick. Moby Dick was actually dedicated to Hawthorne. And so he's famous for his short stories and for novels such as The Scarlet Letter. Most of his novels take place in New England. So a look at dark romanticism. It's a branch of romanticism. Nature reflects a dark and mysterious power. Men are full of evil. Divine is real but threatening. So for emotions, really goes for guilt and fear. And thinks that being optimistic is naive and foolish. Preoccupation with morbid and gloomy concepts. So think about that Raven poem, and it pretty much hits all of these right on the head. So, like Edgar Allan Poe, Hawthorne typically wrote in the dark romantic vein. A lot of his writings offer some interesting looks into the human psyche, especially if you're looking at like Scarlet Letter. So, he is considered a dark romantic. They usually talk about dark versus light, good versus evil, guilt, sin, insanity. His stories often go into the dark side. His protagonists do something that society considers wrong, and then they have to deal with the consequences. And then during that time, he looks at the more destructive tendencies that humans tend to do. Like other romantics, he questions the value of science, especially when it eclipses human intuition and imagination. And then we'll go here. So, as you're reading the bookmark, you might have noticed that the characters aren't always feeling very real. And that's because his tale is what's called an allegory. And so it's a fictional story where they represent the characters, and everything that happens represents ideas or real events that are outside of the story. They don't have fully developed personalities. Instead, they just kind of represent certain types of people. Usually, they're philosophical or political. And then examples of modern day allegories, we have a few down here. The Hunger Games is it could be either a political allegory, it can be a political allegory talking about modern society, and can you look at the Capitol, it's like Hollywood and how they always focus on reality TV, and seem very shallow. My personal favorite, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, is an allegory for the Holocaust. And then Avatar, really like that movie. And it's an allegory for Native American extermination for riches. It's basically like the plot of Pocahontas taking over in space, right? So, looking at these questions here, it's got a quote from Birthmark. Much as Elmer had accomplished, she could not but observe his most splendid successes were almost invariably failures. So why is this an example of foreshadowing? Because it will link his success with his great failure as well. So his greatest success will happen, but it'll also be his greatest failure in that he kills his wife. The common theme in Birthmark is that Humans should not tamper with nature. D. Okay, so Almer, looking at the birthmark, he's really knowledgeable scientist, really good at what he does. He believes that the material world is flawed, but that he can perfect it, and science can perfect all the flaws in this material world. He sees himself almost as an all-powerful being because of his great knowledge of science. He marries Georgiana, and he suddenly has this interest in perfecting the human frame and the human body. And so he believes that she is perfect in the spiritual sense, and almost perfect physically as well. The only issue is that she has a birthmark. It's a very small birthmark on her left cheek, and his obsession is that he needs to remove that birthmark to make her physically and spiritually the most perfect human that she can be. And so his obsession is so extreme that you can tell that he is an allegorical character. He represents the dangers of seeing science and scientists as all powerful. And so if you're looking at this passage here, looking at the obsession, when the morning twilight opened his eyes upon his wife's face and recognized the symbol of imperfection. So he's so obsessed that literally the first thing that happens when he wakes up in the morning is he notices how imperfect his wife is. They sat together at the evening hearth. His eyes wandered to her cheek. So they're sitting there enjoying their nice evening, doing whatever it is you did in the evening in the 1800s, probably staring at a fire, attempting to read, and all he wanted to do was stare at her cheek because she has a little tiny birthmark on it. Flickering with the blaze of the wood fire, the spectral hand that wrote mortality where he would fain have worshipped. So instead of worshipping his wife for being wonderful in every way possible besides that one little birthmark, he just focuses on it, and he's super zoned in on this birthmark. So Georgiana represents spiritual and physical perfection. Back in the day, it was considered to be a perfect wife if you were always wanting to, please your husband, do whatever he wants, take care of him. And so in that way, she also represents kind of what that at that time was the perfect wife. She subordinates herself to her husband, and her own feelings change to match her husband's desires. So if you're looking at how she personally felt about her mark in the beginning of the story versus the end, in the beginning, she thought the birthmark was kind of like a blessing. She was proud of it. She thought it was beautiful. And so she kind of like felt good about herself, and she felt that she was a good, attractive person and worthy. By the end, because he was so obsessed with it, she thought that it was horrible and it needed to go away, and he kind of brought her down into his obsession with how terrible this birthmark was. So it's a stark contrast from the beginning where she thought it was a good thing to the end where she was willing to let him experiment on her. So if we're looking at symbolism within the story, the birthmark is the biggest one. It sits at the center of her cheek, and it's the center of the story. It's the center of their marriage. It's the center of everything in this story. And then you can't mistake the fact that it's shaped like a hand. So it might represent the hand of God, and that man cannot control the hand of God, even with science. Depending on how you look at it, so it could be the hand of God or nature. Another one is that it could also be Almer's hand, because it was his own viewpoints that marred her, that took her beyond remedy. So it was his own viewpoint. It was his own hand that killed her and made her from this perfect person that was had respect for themselves to this person that deteriorated her to this person that didn't believe that she was beautiful or worthy. and went under his scientific experiments and became unable to live. So it depends on how you look at it. You could either see it as God, or it's the hand of the person that's going to eventually take her away from this world. That's a cool thing about symbolism. It just all depends on your viewpoint. So the meaning of the symbol changes. So in the beginning, we're going to look at the birthmark. So the symbol changes from the beginning, where the birthmark was a symbol of her charm. Her lovers would say that a fairy at birth laid its hand on her cheek and left it to impress a token of the magic endowments that were given to her. So it was seen as a charming thing in the beginning. And then it sort of became beauty and imperfection, slightest possible defect, which we hesitate whether to term defect or beauty, shocks me as a visible mark of earthly imperfection. And then it moves to a symbol of sin, where it's a symbol of his wife's liability to sin, sorrow, decay, and death. His somber imagination was not long in rendering the birthmark as a frightful object. And then finally, whenever she dared look into the mirror, there she beheld herself, the crimson birthmark stamped upon her cheek. Not even Elmer now hated it so much as she. So it became a symbol of self-hatred. So it went from charming to self-hatred. And then in the birthmark, it's shaped like what? It's shaped like a hand. And then what happens to her when he finally removes the birthmark? She dies as the last of the birthmark fades away. Alright, so that's covering all of the intricacies of the birthmark, the symbolisms, the allegories, the changing ways of the symbol. If you have questions, let us know. If not, we will see you tomorrow.